Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look at a beta piece of software, and I kind of like to do these sort of software spotlights even on things that aren't quite there yet, but just sort of as an idea of where things are going. So today we're going to look at Adobe Substance 3D Modeler. Now this isn't the first Adobe sculpting program that's been available in VR. There is also Medium that's been around for a while. But the Substance Modeler is part of the Substance acquisition that was made a couple of years ago. I'll put the date on screen if I can find it. But basically it allows you to sculpt using clay, and unlike something like Blender, which uses UVs and tends to work in polygons, we're kind of sculpting directly into clay like a more natural way. So kind of where I prefer modeling, as somebody who kind of grew up with things like Mudbox and Sculptress. So Adobe Substance 3D Modeler is a desktop app and VR application. So Adobe Substance 3D Modeler is currently in beta, so everything that you're going to see and we're going to go through is subject to change. But you can use it using desktop, you can use it in VR. At the moment it's you need to kind of hybridize it because some of the features are only accessible via the desktop, i.e. taking the headset off. And some of them are accessible with the headset. So I'm going to be using the Oculus Quest 2 because that's the headset I've got and it's been my preferred headset. And I'm just going to, in the desktop app, which you can see on screen now here, I'm just going to click New. And I'm just going to dive straight in. So I've already set up my Guardian, I've got my Oculus Link set up. I'm just going to put my headset on. If you hear any sort of background noise, that'll be fans, because computers love to wind up quite a bit. So I'll put the headset on, there we go, and I will just grab my controllers. So here we are, we're in our 3D space. Sort of to give you an idea, we have our left controller. This is our kind of toolkit. This is where we can access our settings, our menu options. You can change all this, by the way, in preferences. So if in the desktop application, if you go to preferences, you can change the orientation of the hands. I'm right-handed, so I'm keeping it in the default orientation. So if you wear the Quest handsets, you've got these two buttons here, a stick and the triggers. If I was to press one of these triggers here, so I can't really point them in real life, but this kind of little grey button here, and click and move it around, I can use that to move my origin point. So this grid at the bottom is kind of X and Y axis here, that's our origin point. If I hold both side triggers in, I can scale in and zoom out, so I can make things bigger or smaller as I see fit. My right controller, this one here, it's got this little orange clay ball. This is our sculpting tool. And if I was to hold my little settings button here, bring up my options menu, I can change the shape of my brush. So let's say I could have a cylinder, and this now changes this tool to be a cylinder. I'm just going to bring myself closer to the origin point, so I'm, there we go, so it's right in front of me like so. And then using the back trigger, I can just simply click and hold and drag to sculpt like so. And as you can see, we can kind of build up that way, so it's a kind of additive modeling process. Let me just undo all of that by pressing left and right on my stick here. And I'm just going to go back to settings, and I'm just going to change the smoothing style here to steady. There we go. So now if I do it, you can see it's moving a lot slower. But if I now hold the back trigger and drag, it should be less steps. So still getting these edges here, but it's a bit smoother than it was before. Let's see if we can refine that anymore. Let's go to single mode. If I do single mode, it basically just, if I drag it, won't let me do more than one at a time. So I can't, hold the trigger and pull like I did before. We can see, we can adjust our size of the brush in the settings there, or up and down on our stick, on our brush tool. So let's say I'm going to just create this cylinder here, and I want to now erode into it, so I'm going to use the circle brush here. I'm going to press my little button here, so this is the A button on my right controller. That changes it now to an eraser, or I could do the same by going into my settings and using the eraser tool options here and choosing the shape and settings like so. Let me just change that from single back to normal. And I can just get my little circle, trigger into it, and start cutting away at my shape. So you can see I can now intuitively start to carve into my model. The pressure setting, by the way, let me just go back to clay mode and back to pressure. So when we're in pressure setting, you can see we have this sort of white circle, and this depends on how hard you press the back trigger. So if I fully press it, it's a lot thicker. If I sort of more gently press it, I can get more kind of tapered edges like so. So I've made like a worm, but you can sort of see what I mean. I can adjust the pressure based on how hard or light I press the trigger button. So let me just undo all that. Get us back to a default scene. So we can play about with all these settings. Let's turn the pressure setting back off, turn the steady off. If I was to press the Y button on my tool button menu here, I can bring up this little grid here, where I can now move my ball of clay along the axes using these little wheel or rotate it, etc., as I would normally. But I can also click on these little white dots here and scale disproportionately depending on the axis I select, or I can scale proportionately if I click on a little white circle on the kind of diagonal axis in this region here. And then when I'm happy, I can just come back out of that, and now I have a new brush size, a new brush, custom brush that I've made basically, and now I can sculpt with this as I see fit. And again, I'm not really aiming to make anything particular today. We have a gouge brush. And the most interesting one kind of is this sort of bone one here. So I can come back out of that. So if I was to press my B button with this tool, and depending on what brush I use, depends on what this option does, I can drag my shape whilst holding the B button to deform my brush, and now I can kind of just conform it into this kind of weird stem shape. Just going to place it there. There we go. Scale myself down. Oh, I've actually made two. There we go, back to one. So I'm going to try and make a flower of some variety. So this is going to be my kind of stem. I'm then going to go back to sphere brush, scale this up to make the kind of centerpiece. Oh, I'm going to switch to single mode just so I don't accidentally double press. There we go. Come on, there we are. So this is my root here. I have created my stem and the kind of the middle part of the flower, kind of what's called. I'm not biology was not my strongest of points, but now we want to kind of add some petals to this. So how are we going to do this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to need to look at creating a new layer, because if we sculpt onto this, which we could go into some issues, especially if we're using the symmetry tool, where the origin point of the symmetrical petals may not behave how we want it to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my little toolkit here on my controller, my left controller, press the X button, and I'm just going to go over to this little panel here, and the top one is our layer panel, and it creates us a new layer. And we can tell this because this is now a darker grey. Well, I'll say darker grey, sorry. This is now a darker terracotta colour, and our current sculpting tool is a lighter one. And you can also get an idea of the kind of UV wrappings that Substance Modeler is generating. So I'm going to use my gizmo tool, so that's the Y button here on my default circle sphere, and we're going to look at adjusting this brush shape. So we have these little white dots here that if I hold the trigger I can drag and pull. So I'm going to pull this one up and make this a thin kind of well, petal shape, for lack of a better word, like so. Turn off my gizmo tool again there, and now I have a kind of more petal style shape. I'm going to bring back up my toolkit, so that's the X button on my left controller. I'm going to press the side button on my brush controller, my right controller. Go to Symmetry, turn on Radial Symmetry, because I'm going to go with a Radial Symmetry style, so you can see now I have multiple copies of my petal, which is in the orientation of the shape I made the petal in, so just bear that in mind. I'm going to duplicate this and have about 8 of these, let's say, and now I'm going to just join them together and confirm. There we go, and just create our kind of radial petal like so. I'm just now going to go back into my settings and turn off radial toggle. There we go. I'm just going to also, we can readjust my shape back to default. So now I have my petals and my flower stem. How do I join this to this? Well, to do that I'm going to press down on my left joystick, and this now changes our sculpting brush into a selection tool. I can now click on this and I've got this blue thing, so I can now move it around like this and reorientate it. If however I'm doing this and it's locked to an axis, I just have to make sure that when I have this selected, so when I press the B button, when I've got click like this, it goes blue. If I can't lock it, for example, it's locked to an axis, I have to make sure that my settings here, down here it says locking, I need to make sure these are off. Sometimes these turn on by default, so just bear that in mind. If I'm sculpting something and I can't move it along the X or Y axis or the Z axis, depending on the orientation of my model, when I'm trying to move it, just check that locking isn't on. So now I can just move this, intercept it into my shape, my flower here, let go to confirm, press this tool here, and I just need to try and get it a bit more centered. Oh, it's quite tricky, probably not going to be perfect. It's close enough, it'll do the job. And I can always go change my layers by going back into here and press inside here, go to sculpting mode, and don't have been sculpting mode, I didn't want to do that, and just select this and this, so now they're one object. And now under here I have some options where I can merge them into one layer, so now these two shapes could become merged into one. I can create a group, so these can be a group that I can then move as a group together, so they're like locked together but not merged together. Flip the selection so I can flip it on one of the axes, and I can also duplicate it. And this is just to increase or decrease the resolution. Oh, which is the UV you can see there. Let me just decrease that so I don't put too much stress on our computer. So this is how we've made our flower. Let's say I want to now carve into it. So I'm going to go to one of my tools here. So we've got our warp tool. So let me just click and drag. So with our warp tool we can pull and stretch out anywhere where our brushes connect, like so. I can always undo by pressing left and right on my control stick, my left stick. So we can adjust things like the dynamics of it. We can adjust the tape here. Up the top where we've got the warp, we can also change it to be an elastic tool. So let's say I'm going to drag this edge here and I'm going to pull it, like so. we can warp it, and it kind of has a bit more elasticity to it. So it kind of gets thinner the more you pull it, and it kind of pulls everything in relation to it. Let's just undo both of those again. So you can see, you can kind of, a lot of this is self-explanatory. I'm not going to go through this whole toolkit. Likewise with the remove tool, we can just chop away bits from our shape that we don't want. We have our smooth tool. So if I press up and down on the brush tool, by the way, I can adjust the size of my brush at any point, and I can just start to smooth out any edges. So like here at this corners here, I can smooth them out and round them off like that, and I can adjust the scale and the size. So that's fill crevices, that's flatten bumps. So let's try a flatten bump and see what that does differently. Yeah, so that kind of is a bit more harsh on that in that regard. Fill cavities. I don't think this is actually going to do anything on this shape because we haven't got any holes in this one. We can use the inflate tool. So the inflate tool means we can kind of pull vertices, for lack of a better word really, out and make things kind of inflate at that point. So you can see how this has now become quite bumpy and inflated. Can also do the similar thing to remove, so we can carve in the same way, so we can deflate essentially. So this is where I'm cutting holes into my shape, just using the deflate tool. But lastly, also placement here. This is where you can adjust wherever things are placed freehand, like where my brush is, where they're placed on kind of axis. So this adjusts where my brush is in relation to myself, for example. And surface placement is whenever the brush touches a mesh, then it can start to add or subtract. And lastly, we have our paint tool. So this is our way of kind of painting our model. Now, we haven't got into painting yet, so you may have noticed that throughout this video we have this little palette brush here. If I bring this little blue arrow and touch it against it, I can bring up my colour wheel and I can choose a colour. Let's just zoom myself in so we want to take the model. I can now paint onto my mesh like so. Now this would probably be best done if you're working on a particular layer at a time. At the moment it's all grouped together and I'm in one kind of merged layer, so it's not the best way of doing this. But I can paint onto my model like so, and just sort of paint it. Now this isn't at all meant to be a kind of any form of replacement for Substance Painter or Designer. They are kind of the better way of doing it. We'd want to take this model out, put it into one of those programs, add more decals, textures, displacement maps, etc. that way. But this is a kind of way where you can sort of assign a colour to an area, and then that would become in Substance Painter or Designer, depending on what you're using for what workflow. These can then become material groups that you can then assign and add your own textures and materials to. So yeah, there's my terrible flower. But yeah, as you can see, at any point we can just enter the settings. These settings, by the way, are all present on the desktop version. The desktop version, though, does require more keyboard shortcuts. I kind of find it a bit more intuitive to sculpt in the space. And let's see if what this does. Is it going to do anything to me? Put back into clay and let's try. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I kind of find this more intuitive. Now, one thing I didn't quickly cover, actually, I'm just going back into Symmetry Tool here. So you can see I've got the circle here, but if I was to press my B button and click and hold it, whilst I am dragging my brush around, I can distort my brush without having to go into the gizmo tool. So I can kind of depending on how I move my controller, stretch and skew my shape, like so. And let's try using a square just because it'll give a bit more obviousness of what's happening. So I can stretch and skew like that. And if I use my stick, I think, let's see if I can, yeah. So if I use the left and right on my stick here, I can taper. So using my left controller, I can taper my shape like so. And again, this depends very much on the kind of shape of brush you're using as to what your controls do at this point. So I could just have like some gold bars, like so. But yeah, this has just been a very fly-by look, kind of first impressions look at Substance 3D Modeler. Currently in beta. It's somewhat limited, but at the same time, I can see premise in this. And everything that you see here is obviously subject to change at any point. You know, nothing here is set in stone. And there we go. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly take my headset off, like so. And I'm going to go back onto my desktop screen. Zoom out, and as you can see here, here's my 3D model, and I can still, within this program, move things around. I can still distort things and add shapes the same way as I can in VR. It's just a little bit more difficult in some ways. And then I can just go to File, Export. You can also import meshes, so you can actually import an FBX model into this program, or an OBJ, I think. And then obviously in preferences is where you can adjust whether the left or right controllers are flipped, and some of the things like settings like pressure sensitivity through the preferences. So I'm just going to go to export just to show you what the export options are here. So we can export as FBX. See if the drop down works. OBJ or .usd. We can preserve instances, so positive transform scales only, vertex color, so these are the colors that we've applied. Output as triangles, quads, so this is for our kind of more for our UV purposes, just our quality, and then we can just export this and then import it into something like Blender or any other 3D modeling program and do the kind of more nuances in them. So this is a kind of more of a kind of quick way of making organic models, I'd say. It's better, I think, for organic shapes, much like mud boxes, than working in a polygonal modeling program, more like what CAD programs tend to be. So this has just been a kind of, like I said, this is the first impressions looking at a beta piece of software, Adobe Substance 3D Modeler. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I will see you again soon. Goodbye.